All right, so I am now recording. Hi, Luke.
Hi. So, yeah, you had mentioned to me that you were wanting to talk about Calvinism, and forgive me, I actually met with Paul, and forgive me, Paul, for not being able to pronounce your name. Paul the other charismatic Paul, who Paul VanderKlay has interviewed.
Okay.
But he's local here, and we met this morning, and I just talked to him for about 2 hours, so my voice, we'll see
Okay.
how my voice does. But anyhow, we were going to talk about Calvinism, and I don't know, I'm equally excited to talk to you about that as, I don't know, I'm just excited to talk to you in general, because I would love to know your perspectives on it, because I can't remember if during your journey you ever were involved in Calvinist circles or thought or had that framework. I definitely did. That was my predominant framework up until Orthodoxy, and I'm still kind of figuring out how Orthodoxy and Calvinism, the history of that, and how Orthodox think of Calvinism. But I don't really know where you take it. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I am a nerd, and I am a theology nerd, and I went deeply into the circles when I was there.
Okay,
So,
well, I'll tell you what my contact with it was.
okay.
So, after I left from the Jehovah's Witnesses, I tell people I worked my way backwards through the Protestant Reformation. So part of that was that I started doing talks on cults, because of my background in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and I got involved with what Protestants call counter-cult ministries, where they're actually actively trying to reach people in cults, and this included some involvement with people coming at the cult phenomena also from the legal and psychological and sociological perspective, not merely from the religious perspective.
Okay.
Although it was, I was involved with a wide variety of people, and I was also invited to do talks at a number of local churches, and even some, national conferences and things on the topic of cults, or on the topic of Jehovah's Witnesses specifically. And in the course of doing that, I had a lot of contact with both the wider evangelical circles and the Calvinist, various denominations, Presbyterian and Reformed Christians, and just others, So I'm doing things like I would maybe even go to 2 different churches within one Sunday, sit through their service, maybe give a talk, or I'd be talking to people in that congregation. And so I don't know if it's because I grew up in a cult. Probably, that's probably the reason I have this. I don't know whether you want to call it a strength or a weakness, but I can quickly get the sense of like the ethos of a group, and the way they're using their language, and I can quickly kind of fit in and sort of mirror what they're doing in this, not in, I don't want to say like in a false way, but just in order to be able to communicate with them. I can see what are their particular verbal little things that they like to say, their jargon and whatever, and understand it. And during this time, I was also doing a tremendous amount of reading by different kinds of theology and different aspects of Christianity, because I was trying to figure out where I was going to be, And in the course of my journey, I actually spent some time in a Lutheran congregation as a member of a Lutheran congregation, and actually it was a Lutheran pastor who gave me my Christian baptism.
Okay.
So for a while I was working at that Lutheran church as a secretary, because the opening had come up. They needed someone to put together their bulletin for their liturgy. So this dove me into liturgy, right? And the pastor was also seeing to me as, a divorced mom of 4 kids, who needed some little additional income kind of thing, and also access to a computer, which I did not personally have, but I was able to like use the computer at that church to like put together my presentations and stuff that I was doing at other churches. So he was helping me out, but I was doing the work for him. And so in the pastor's study, in the pastor's office, there were many volumes of the Concordia Theological Journal, going back to, I think, all the way back to the 1930s.
Wow.
So sometimes after I was done with what I was supposed to do, and I was just really being a receptionist, kind of like being there in case somebody knocked on the door kind of thing, I was reading through these old Lutheran theological journals. Well, a large part of that, the polemics in those journals, and they were almost entirely polemical, a large part of it was adversarial towards Calvinism. That was a large part of what was consuming the thinking and the writing of those journals. And I mean, even more so, of course, they were no fans of Catholicism either, but their real animus was towards Calvinism. So I really,
in the Concordia?
Yeah. Concordia is now we're talking about mid 20th century, like maybe 1930s, 1940s, even like before the Second World War kind of stuff. That's how old these journals were, that I was able to just get in and sort of like look and see what was the conversation going on.
Okay.
They were very anti-Calvinist. And in fact, the tone, like if you think that some of the polemics between Christians today are distressing, you should have seen the tone that these journals took. I mean, they were excoriating, and there was absolutely no distinction between the thinking of a person and the person. I mean, there was like no sense of, oh, you're making an ad hominem. It was all one. If you had these ideas, you were held in contempt.
Yeah.
And so I spent some time looking through that, and I thought it was quite interesting. It was giving me a kind of a sense of the background of where I was currently sitting. At the same time, I was also, of course, studying Lutheran doctrine and the Lutheran approach to things. And I came to realize that, I got to tell you one other thing.
Yeah.
So around this time, I was at a conference, I think it was called Evangelical Ministries to New Religions Conference. And there were a couple of guys there who had been in the California Bible Answer Man show.
Yeah.
And they were Reformed. Okay. So anyway, we happened to be sitting at a table together, and they knew that I was in a Lutheran church, and they were, Calvinists. And we're sitting at a table together eating lunch or something, and all surrounding us are all these other Christians, most of whom were like, evangelical, ranging from the believe it, receive it, name it, grab it, or blab it, grab it, name it, claim it crowd, and the and various evangelical churches, charismania people, just a wide variety of the whole evangelical swath of evangelicalism. Mm-hmm. So one of these guys kind of leaned forward to me at the table, and he said, and he's looking around at all these other Christians who don't have the kind of systematic thinking, theology that you've got in Calvinism. Mm-hmm. And he says, don't you think that we Lutherans and Calvinists, we Lutherans and the Reformed have to stick together to carry forward the banner of the Reformation? Because you can see that these people out here aren't going to do it. Mm. And I just started laughing. I said, you guys have no idea how deeply in the DNA of Lutheranism is a contempt for Calvinism, because I had been reading all this stuff. I said,
Huh.
you guys just do not realize how to what depths there is a cleavage in that thinking.
Hmm.
The Lutherans would much rather make common cause with the Catholics than they would with the Calvinists. At least in the conservative Lutheran, arena that I was in. I was in the LCMS. Of course, I don't know what they're doing over there in, the ELCA or those other bodies. But the LCMS was real conservative at that time.
Well, that's so interesting, because my greatest familiarity is with the LCMS. It's what my family by marriage is in that world, and so I had one of the pastors there had given me the Concordia but I always, and I guess this is just showing my ignorance, I always thought Lutherans were Calvinists.
Oh no.
So you could, I mean, I mean, I don't want to derail your narrative, but then, so how would they, in a Protestant frame, how would they categorize their understanding of like sovereignty and free will? Does it fit into like a Calvinist, Arminian, open theist box?
Well, I would say, and this is going to get to why I ended up feeling like I was sitting on a point of tension.
Mm-hmm.
The Lutherans are not as systematic, I would say, is not as systematic in their thinking or their theology as the Calvinists are.
Okay.
And they're more comfortable with mystery. Their sense of ecclesiology is different from the Calvinist sense. And a lot of it is more, I almost want to say, a lot of it feels like it's almost more aesthetic than actually nailed down theologically. But they definitely have these points of tension. And the way that I thought of it, and when you get to the predestination and, all of that, they're more comfortable with a more mystery, relying on God's grace kind of thing, without, the double predestination they do not hold to. And so when you're, as a Lutheran, I really started feeling like I was sitting on a point of tension. If I wanted something that satisfied that kind of like intellectual rigor for a more systematic, a deeply systematic, thought out theology, then I would either have to go towards Catholicism or towards Calvinism. I actually thought of that as the choices, that I was just sitting at a point that couldn't hold and would have to tilt one way or the other. And I had a lot of discussions with a couple of friends of mine about this at the time. One of whom was, very much anti-Catholic. And, so in fact, it's my anti-Catholic friend who sent me, for some reason, thinking that it was an argument against the Catholic Church, sent me Newman's essay on the development of doctrine.
Whoops.
Yeah. So anyway, I felt like I couldn't sit on that point of tension and had to make a decision either way. So I went towards the Catholic. But I remember that, and in the course of doing all of this, I was really trying to put my finger on what it was about the Calvinism versus the Catholicism, and this point where I think the Lutherans more would make the common cause towards the Catholic versus the Calvin. And it's a real deep thing. It's not, I have never seen anyone else explicate it, but it's what I came through in my mind. And I think when you hear it, that you're going to go, okay, so here it is. I think that what Calvinism does is it makes God's fatherhood a function of his sovereignty.
Mm.
Whereas in the Catholic understanding, in Orthodox understanding, God's sovereignty is a function of his fatherhood. Now, I can see the wheels are turning in your head.
Well, it's connecting to something I've heard recently. Keep going.
So, and this is in no way is this slam against all the amazing great Christians who are Calvinists,
Yeah,
including
absolutely.
Paul VanderKlay, who I
The
just
great,
declare like
honorable,
crazy.
venerable Paul VanderKlay. Yes.
Yes. But I think that this goes. I think that this is underneath. This operates underneath people's conscious awareness that this is what's happening. Because of course, if you push on the theology, the Trinitarian theology of the Calvinists, it's very rigorous that God is Father, from eternity, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
They recognize, I mean, they're not in argumentation with the doctrinal statements, Catholic doctrinal statements about the Trinity.
Right.
But the sense that your first thing that you think about or that you sense about God is his sovereignty, and then the fatherhood after, so that you see the fatherhood. So it's like, and this is not and the problem with this is it's not in relation to the Trinity doctrine. It's in relation to God's relation to us. So they're keeping their Trinitarian when it comes to the doctrine of God. It ends up being, I think, percolating through the way that the human person's relationship with God is. So it's like God is sovereign, and in order to have beings over whom to exercise his sovereignty, he fathers them.
That sounds like a sermon on Romans 9 I've heard or something. Yeah.
As opposed to God is Father, and in carrying out his functional role as Father toward his children, he exercises sovereignty on their behalf. Do you see the difference between those two things? Yes.
Yeah. And so a few thoughts that I have when you were saying that. This really reminds me of, so I haven't yet dove into, and I think I probably eventually will. I'm intrigued enough to David Bentley Hart's recent work on universalism, his book on universalism. But in podcasts that I've heard recently with him talking about this, as he is wont to do, he talks about his strongly worded disgust of Calvinism, because he is adamant. So, but he talks of sovereignty, and he says this is when you said that, it triggered my mind back to what he said. Is he said that in Calvinism and in that frame, that sovereignty is elevated to like the supreme attribute of God.
Yeah.
And I think the way that you said it is essentially just another way to say that, really, that it's almost as if the Father is subject to the sovereignty versus the sovereignty subject to the fatherhood of God. And I don't know, and this is where I think David Bentley Hart would say this, and I think it's true. And I think it flows into a lot of things that we're experiencing in the modern Christian world in the West, and a lot of what Nathan Jacobs said in Reaching the Nuns and things, and how our broader vision of God that we sense intuitively is rejecting a certain form of Christianity, and this is even what you and Vervaeke and JP got into, the kind of non-viable Christianity, is because when you elevate God's sovereignty and certain systematic understandings of his sovereignty within a frame of predestination, and even though, I mean, I don't know of any, I've never met a living Calvinist that would affirm double predestination. However, I don't know how you can't within that logical framework. But when you do that, this is where I think that you said that somehow it's kept distinct from the Trinitarian theology. But when you put sovereignty, when fatherhood is not higher in the hierarchy than sovereignty, so that you lose your vision of God is clouded with, like, you know, the prodigal son and the parable of the lost sheep, and when you don't understand the reconciling fathering love of God, or when that is put in as an inferior thing to the sovereignty and predestination, that does get into Trinitarian issues, because you've clouded, I would say, the image of what the Father is.
Well, here's what I would say about it. I think their Trinitarian theology remains technically correct. Okay? But what it does is it makes a break between the Trinitarian theology and the theology of the incarnation, redemption, justification, all of that. In other words, there's a, and this is hard to talk about because there are definitely ontological differences, but there's a, we're supposed to be Christ's brothers.
Yeah.
So you get into this whole thing of, you know, what you're doing is you're creating a way in which God is the Father of Jesus in a way that he is not our Father. But he is, of course, the Father of Jesus in a way that he's not our Father, because he's by nature Jesus' Father, and he's our Father by adoption. So it's difficult to tease this out, but there's a sense in which it's too much. There's too much of a difference. So there's a right and a wrong difference. Okay, so when Jesus was at the tomb, and was it Mary Magdalene? He was talking to her, and he said, you know, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. Right? He didn't say, I'm ascending to our Father. Jesus never says our Father, except when he's telling the disciples how to pray. He never puts fatherhood, right? The fatherhood of God with him and on the same level as the fatherhood of us, because we're God's children by adoption. He's God's child by nature. Whereas the Father is the God of Jesus, not by nature, but by grace. It's in his coming and taking on flesh and becoming human that he then addresses God the Father as God. Otherwise, he would not. So he makes that distinction. He doesn't say, I'm ascending to our Father and our God. He says, my Father and your Father, my God and your God. So, because there's a distinction in the relationship, there's a difference in the relationship there because of who Christ is eternally. So there is a distinction, but there has to be, the distinction is not at, I don't know if I want to say that it's not on the level of, I guess, love. Maybe I could say that, because right, because my Father will love you as he loves me. They come in we will come and dwell with you, and all of that language that's there
Well, I
in
was
the book
thinking of
of
the high
John.
priestly prayer, yeah, when you were talking about that. But yeah.
Yeah, so there's that. There's this drawing of us into the identity of Christ for being beloved of the Father, right? And so even though there is ontologically a distinction, definitely, between us and Jesus in terms of him having the nature of God and the nature of man.
Yeah.
In
So I
terms
mean,
of the love, if you follow the Calvinism out logically, the way that God deals with us as human beings is so divorced from his love of Christ. It doesn't flow through. So I think it takes the Trinitarian. I know I'm so rough in the way I'm expressing this, but it doesn't take that Trinitarian theology and it doesn't send it through all the levels of being, society, family, person, the way it should, way it does in Catholicism and in Orthodoxy. So now I'm done.
okay.
I've reached the limits of my power.
Uh, so what I was thinking, I mean, usually when I'm in conversation with people, I have a few voices in my head. I have where I think I am. I have previous iterations of myself and alternate perspectives speaking in devil's advocates. So as you were talking, I would say, I think I'm still able to embody somewhat of a Calvinist perspective. I think a Calvinist, or my former Calvinist self, would say in a conversation like this, that it's not that. I think within the frame, they would say that God only loves human beings through Christ. But then this, I think the category and the way the system would all work is that, but God only loves those that are in Christ, and those are the elect. And that has to do with like the whole tulip, that has to do with the limited atonement. The atonement was only for the elect. It was for those that God had predestined before the foundation of the world to be in Christ. And so they think that those that are in Christ are loved by God. And I think they would say that I think all Christians would say, from every perspective, I think, I don't know how else you could think of this, that human beings are only loved in Christ. But depending upon your frames of how you construct that and how you think of that, that's going to be, you're going to flesh that out differently. A Calvinist would say that to be loved in Christ is to be elect, and we know those that are elect, who are sealed in the Spirit, who have. If you just ask a Calvinist, different ones are going to have different answers of how you know who's elect. And in my experience, most people who are Calvinists, who are very thoughtful, at some point have existential crisis where they wonder, like, how do I know if I'm elect? What if I'm not elect? And I only think I'm elect, and it spins you in this whole cycle. And so I don't know that a Calvinist would say that it's not in Christ that you are loved. And I don't know what that means for your how Trinitarian it is.
Well, okay. See, it's not really the Trinity doctrine where the fault line is. It's something to do with God's relationship with his creation and relationship with us, that then somehow gets very, to me, cut off from the Trinitarianism in some way. Okay, so the love is in this respect, not that we have loved God, but that God loved us, right? So, and while we were yet sinners, right, Christ died for us.
Mm-hmm.
And so this this kind of generate initiative, taking generative love of God precedes our union with Christ through baptism or through belief or anything, right?
Well, yeah, that's the Calvinist doctrine of regeneration, which is that's I don't know if you've heard the terms monergism versus synergism, like whether or not regeneration is monergistic or synergistic.
There's one actor or
right, because that's the Calvinist perspective, is that is the initiating grace of God, because we are dead in our trespasses and sins, and they take that in a very, I mean, interestingly symbolic way, because spiritualized way, I guess, of, because they say it, because I've heard not countless, but many sermons about that very thing, that like salvation is not like making a sick man well, it's like making a dead man live. And so they just say, we're dead in our trespasses and sins, we're by nature enemies of God and doing evil things, living in this life. I mean, all that Pauline language, and then God in his mercy makes us alive together with Christ. But then this is the hard part about all that conversation, is the devil's in the details, is what do all those things mean? And so, and I would say any conversation on Calvinism, I was thinking this as we were talking, would not be even close to doing justice to the topic if we didn't talk about Romans 9, because I know like the Calvinist in me is always going to go there, which is what it and so I would like your take on that too, but it's what if, so this is in where to start in Romans 9. I don't want to read the whole thing. But it's
my Bible. I'm not sure it's in this. Oh, here it is, right here.
Well, you're a Catholic. You don't have a Bible. I'm just kidding. That's a bad joke, I guess. So it's talking about Jacob and Esau, and so it's
Jacob. I have loved, Esau I have hated.
Right, and so then it goes on. Then so it says, just
vessels of wrath, vessels of war. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it goes on to say, then what shall we say then, that there is no injustice with God? Is there? May it never be. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I raised you up, to demonstrate my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. So then he has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens who he desires. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who resists his will? On the contrary, who are you, O man, to answer back to God? The thing molded will not say to the molder, why did you make me like this, will it? Or does not the potter have a right over the clay to make from the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for common use? What if God, although willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, which the version I've normally read is predestined for destruction? And he did so to make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory. Even us, whom he also called, not from among the Jews only, but also from among the Gentiles. And so then it goes on. But that text, I know will come up with every Calvinist in my life when you start talking about this conversation. And it gets into the broader conversation of Romans 9 in isolation from Romans 9 through 11 or 12, and
Romans 8.
Yeah.
That the creation is subjected to futility.
Yes, and it ends in like the reconciliation of all things.
Right.
Which, and this gets into like, this is essentially, all that reminds me of, this is essentially David Bentley Hart's argument. One of his big arguments from his book is that, and he says this, and I can't fully flesh it out, and he's not here to say it, but he says any framework, any logical, rational Christian framework that isn't universalist has internal inconsistencies. Like, that's what he says. And so because really, apart from so I don't know, that passage, I don't know exactly what Paul is arguing for in that passage and what he's saying. I mean, I have ways that I would interpret it within a universalist lens, but I know that's where Calvinists go. A Calvinist reads that and they say, God picks and chooses. He loves Jacob. He doesn't like Esau. Jacob is called. Esau's not. Pharaoh isn't called. God hardens him, and he softens others. I mean, that passage fits right into the whole tulip framework.
Yeah, it does, and I understand that. Now, one of the things I actually went at some point in my backwards journey through Protestantism, I actually went to like a Billy Graham crusade training thing, and they teach you to do the Romans Road thing, right? Which right? And one thing I figured out in time was that if you go to a particular book of the Bible or passage of Scripture with the wrong question, you're going to get the wrong answer.
Yeah,
So
I think that's true.
It seems like the Romans is one of those books that people will go to it, and the question they're asking is, what is, how can I be saved? And
yeah,
I don't think that that's what was on St. Paul's mind when he wrote the book of Romans. Let me tell you what I think was on his mind.
Okay.
What I think was on his mind was this. I've had this encounter with Christ, and I've been commissioned with him to do this preaching, to the world of the Gentiles. I, who am a Jew and who, grew up following the law, know that Christ is the Redeemer of mankind. Now, having come to these conclusions about Christ, what can I now say about the status of the Jewish people? Where do I land in terms of my people who I love, those for whom, if God would save them, I would be willing, as he pretty much concludes in the book of Romans, I would be willing to go to hell for all of them.
Yeah.
Myself, personally.
Yep.
Right? I would be willing to be separated from Christ on their behalf, if only. Right? Yeah. What can I now say? And that is his entire argument, going back through salvation history into the, although he would never use the term salvation history, but going back into what we like to call salvation history now, all the way back to the separation of the Jewish people from the pagan culture and all of that, and what people should know about God based on their observation of the natural world, were their minds not darkened by sin, etc. All of that, the whole thing all the way through is to answer that question. That's the question that Paul is dealing with. And that's what the burden of his heart is in writing the book of Romans. And how do I now account for these Gentiles being brought in? And if they're brought in and they're replacing my people, what do I say about this? What's going to happen to my people? That's like really what he's wrestling with in this, to me, what I see him wrestling with through this text. So I think that and that's not to discount anything that he says in the book of Romans, or to take anything, or to pick and choose, I like this verse, not that verse, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But it's to look at what is the burden of the argument that he's making through that book. And so I think that the whole kind of like picking the few verses out, the 4 or 5 verses that are that walk of the Roman road to get somebody to accept Christ, I think is not a good use of that text. And it's certainly, well, let me put it this way, it's an extremely unsophisticated use of that text.
Yeah. Well, and that's one, I guess it's one, looking at Romans 9 and whether or not you look at it in context of the whole Romans or Romans 8 through 11, 12. I mean, you, that's one angle. That's an exegetical angle, which isn't unimportant. And then looking at the whole scope of Scripture, and then also bringing in all these other factors that we were talking about earlier, of even like you're in what a certain perspective on.
You're freezing up there, Luke.
on sovereignty does to your image and your conception of father, because really there you are.
Yeah, we're gonna have to repeat that. We're gonna have to repeat that last part, I think. Let me see if I can.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I don't know what happened.
Check. Yeah, I got a notice that my internet
You
connection
froze
was
again.
unstable for a moment. So now it seems like it's working okay. All right.
Yeah, now it's better.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I think
This
we're
will
good now. Okay.
This will be a
So you
challenge for
need
your
to,
editing skills.
yeah, or you can I guess maybe repeat what you said in the last like minute.
Yeah. So what I was trying to say is that I think the exegesis is one factor, and I think people that come at the Bible with certain philosophical presuppositions about the Bible and revelation and foundationalism in a certain way that they understand the text is revealing things almost objectively to them about God and the nature of things. Those are all assumptions inherent within that, but I think the intuition of what elevating sovereignty above fatherhood does is also important, and arguably equally as important, because this is the thing, and I think this is what David Bentley Hart essentially is trying to say, is that if you argued in your own family, like my family, I have 3 kids. If I was to argue, like, one of them I loved, one of them I hated, and it was just to show the wonders of my sovereignty, you would say that's atrocious and evil and wicked, and you're a terrible father. But yet we can't take that logic and apply it to God, because then if you do that, or if you said this to a Calvinist, they would say, like, God works in mysterious ways. These are things that are too wonderful for us. Who am I to question God? Or an appeal to mystery, right? So, like, this is my problem with Calvinism, is that personally I have never seen how you can get around double predestination. If God is electing for people for salvation in Christ and union with Christ and heaven and the new heavens and the new earth and all that, then necessarily he's not electing people for it. And so either in a passive way or an indirect way or whatever, he's electing people for reprobation, for hell.
Right.
Unless you're some form of a Christian universalist and you believe that even through that, and who knows what happens through all things, that eventually God is going to reconcile all things to himself through purgatory or some sort of, like, C.S. Lewis, The Great Divorce, or whatever. But like, but if you believe in a hell that goes on forever and there's a lot of exegetical issues with the word eternal biblically. and how it's translated. But if you believe in an unending hell, particularly one of conscious torment for people, and you're a Calvinist, that God's a monster. Like, I can't see any way around it. And again, like, you could appeal to mystery, and I guess, that's fine. At least that's a way to assuage your God-given conscience for realizing that that's monstrous. But there have been Calvinists, and I mean, this is why, like, this, I always talk about George MacDonald and his Sermon on Justice, because I love it so much. Because, like, if you're a Calvinist and you haven't read George MacDonald's Sermon on Justice, you're not dealing with the best critiques of your worldview, because he speaks strongly against that view of God, and doesn't mince his words, and he says, and he says that essentially he doesn't believe that even people who profess to believe that really believe it, because it's too monstrous. And he's like, and I know some of these people, and they're too good of people to believe in a God like that. And so that's where the argument for me really starts to break down. Like, I understand Romans 9, I understand the general framework, but I also have a belief that God is better than me. And yes, I could appeal to mystery, that God is somehow better than me. I could, as a Calvinist, and I think I used to do this, that God is somehow better than me, but yet there's elect and there's reprobate, and he has elected those, and I don't see a way around double predestination, and somehow that is glorious and loving and good in a way that I can't understand, but I can't articulate it and talk to you about it in words.
Right.
I have to punt to mystery.
I think that, to go back to, like, let's say like the conversation that I have with John VanderKlay.
Okay.
I think that, and speaking of Romans, this Romans 10:21, but of Israel he says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. But that's really a stand-in for all of us. All day long he is holding out his hands to a disobedient and contrary people. I was thinking, after I did one of my Ratzinger videos, one time I should have said, where he talks about turning around, making that conversion, that turn, that if there was a theme song that God was for God's relationship to the human race, it would be turn around, look at me. That there's that constant, he's making that constant appeal. Okay, so when John VanderKlay is talking to me on when we were talking with JP, I don't know if you saw that, or you only saw Paul VanderKlay's.
I started watching it, so I don't think I saw the end. I watched Paul's and I saw the beginning. Okay,
so the more that, so at the end I asked John VanderKlay, what is your definition of being?
Great question.
And he gets into this language that every time he's pushed into the metaphysics, or I shouldn't say pushed, enticed to talk about, or whatever you want to say it. When he starts talking about the metaphysics, same thing happened when he talked about with Jonathan Pajot. Same thing happened when he had his one-on-one conversation with JP before JP and I spoke. That you get to a point where you're in some way using personalist language. You're talking about something that has an activity of structuring, of ordering, of creating possibility, or opening space for possibility. And you go on and you keep trying to use this language and say, but not a person, and yet all of the verbs that you're using are actually, the only way that we know what those things are is as the actions of a person. And so Why was I mentioning that? Oh,
You were.
because the reality of things is, and even John Vervaeke uses this language, shining, right? The reality of things shines to us. And through that shining, there is someone behind that shining through to us. And I think that whether you're, regardless of your affiliation as a Christian, I think that one of the things that happens, because you do encounter Christ in the Gospels, the love of Christ shines through to you. But I think that even if you go outside of the Christian framework, those who may even be, for intellectual or other reasons, saying no to that particular way of construing reality, that it's still shining through to them. I mean, St. John says that Christ is the light that enlightens every man. And so I think that when you talk about the Calvinists and having this very hard, rigid structure in their head and this double predestination, that the penetration of the messages of Christ in the gospel and the parables, like you mentioned, the prodigal son and all that, it still penetrates to them. It keeps them from walking around thinking that God is a monster. They don't. They love him because they're still, in spite of this screen of this doctrine, they're still experiencing his love.
Yes.
And so that's what I think makes the difference.
Yeah, but that's at that the experience of God's love, and I think that's essentially what George MacDonald was trying to say, that they don't really believe it, is because they are experiencing God's love and they are seeing these other things, and that's what he was saying. They're good men. They can't believe this. They're good men. It's impossible. And so he's saying, like, in their, I mean, this is what I would call like the noetic vision. They're seeing through to the goodness. And that's the thing. And through narrative and through story, it transcends that hard thing, the intellect. Story is the thing that plays in all those places, and love.
Right.
Like, that's what Lewis himself said that. Like, that's why he said he started writing fiction, is because it gets past the watchful gatekeepers. It teaches you things that you don't even know you're learning.
Right.
And so, yeah, I agree with you. And I think we all have, I mean, that's what we're essentially talking about with Calvinism, is the same thing that's going on in this broader meaning crisis, is like the difference between conscious belief and acted belief. And sometimes those are more incongruents in certain individuals than in other individuals, but like, we are more than our mere intellect comprehends, and so like that's why with a Calvinist is, I don't know, if they want to, you could maybe say there's like a Calvinist 1 and a Calvinist 2. There's a Calvinist 1 who acts according to those professed beliefs, and they're gonna probably not be someone I like that much. And there's a Calvinist number 2 who professes to believe those things and acts more in tune with the noetic belief of the beauty of a loving father that's shining all over the place, and me and that person are going to be fine.
Right. Well, I wonder, as we talk about this whole thing with fatherhood, see, we have such a crisis of fatherhood in our culture. And I kind of wonder if deep underneath that kind of Protestantism hasn't in some way caused a deformation in the deep in the structure, maybe at the archetypal level of fatherhood, so that the only thing that really can overcome it is going to be a real either having, like Paul VanderKlay has, an excellent father
Mm-hmm.
in this world, which he, by every account, had, or some kind of way for fatherhood, loving fatherhood, to once again find its expression. I think Jordan Peterson, Jocko Willink, guys like that are pushing that out into the world. And you see how many people respond and overcome their sense of meaninglessness by that encounter with that kind of fathering going on. And so I think all of these things are tied in so deeply and psychologically at levels that we can't even really, almost really explicate. But it's good stuff for our next conversation, which has to be about the masculine feminine stuff, right?
Oh, that's just where I was just gonna tease that, because that's what I was thinking. I actually got into that a little bit in my conversation with Paul, because I think talking about the masculine and the feminine, and masculine and feminine spirituality in regard to the meaning crisis, to me, is almost one of the deepest and most profound ways to talk about it. And I think that's true. I think our culture is very deficient of healthy masculinity, and well, and in a way, it's both too, and healthy femininity, because it's been my contention recently that most of our cultural expressions in the West are masculine. They're either overtly unhealthy masculine, which is too domineering, too controlling, too judging, too incisive, too not creating enough space, kind of like what Peugeot was talking about the other day with who was that? That wasn't JP. It was the one before that. Oh, it's when he was talking with Rebecca, maybe, but they were talking about opening up space.
Yeah.
That's what the feminine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's not a lot of that in American culture. It's just judgment, identitarianism, labels, judge. So we don't have a lot of space. I actually think that's what these local meetup groups are, where people are feeling free to come in and be open and authentic. That's a resurgence of divine femininity, because really, and then we have femininity. I think we have masculinity masquerading as femininity. And so I agree. I think a lot of that is at the core of what's going on too. But it's, and this is why story is so important, is because it's one thing to talk about things at the idea level, but even with Paul and his dad and how emotional he was in the last video, it's really hard to argue with an icon of the divine father, which is essentially what Paul's dad was. How could he, it was shining through him. Paul said that when he was sitting there in worship. That's at the level of what Rebecca and Peugeot were talking about, that is narrative, but that narrative as an icon transcends to what's shining through behind it.
Right.
Transcends all these logical categories and debates.
Yeah. Well, it's so complicated. Okay, so, I did one video about receptivity, the agency of receptivity, talking about the feminine. And I want to get into this, the next video I want to do about it is the distortion, or I almost want to call it the sins of femininity, but that's not quite exactly right. But how those traits of femininity can be perverted and then become malevolent, right? Want to talk about that, and then start talking about feminine vocation, masculine vocation, but also the understanding that, which to some extent this gets a little bit into the Jungian stuff, but it's also present in the Orthodox iconography, that the masculine contains the feminine and the feminine contains the masculine. Of course, it's in the it's that little symbol, the symbol with the swirl in it, and the circle with the swirl in it.
Oh, the yin yang.
The yin yang symbol, right?
Yeah.
It's in there that the masculine contains feminine, and the feminine contains
Yeah,
masculine.
absolutely.
So it's a, when these things become unbalanced, they become unbalanced at all the levels. And so I think that's what we have to look at. We have to look at all the levels, because it's the individual human person, it's the family, it's the structure of society. This thing with masculinity, and when you say, and talking about fatherlessness. So I was talking recently with a man who works at a particular kind of job where there's just a lot of physical stuff that has to be done. There's a lot of screws that have to be turned. There's a lot of stuff that has to be cut. There's a lot of things that have to be caulked. There's things that have to be put together and assembled, and all of that kind of work, and working with machines and all of this stuff. And he was talking about the younger men that are coming in to the company now, and how completely unfamiliar they seem to be with the physical world.
Yeah.
With turning screws, with picking up a power tool and handling it, and all of that, and just the amount of training and stuff that it takes. And he attributes it to, I guess this is what happens when you have a fatherless generation. They're just their ability to act as men in contact with the physical world has just, the loss of that, you take, he's just talking about one workplace, but you start structuring that all through the society. And then the men to whom all of this stuff has been so intuitive all of their lives, that World War II and just right after it generation, as they pass off the scene, and you lose that, you just are losing so much. People talk about things like brain drains and things like that, but you're really losing competencies. You're losing competencies in the world that the whole society needs so badly. And then I don't know if you ever heard, I heard it on like an NPR podcast. I think I can't remember the name of the podcast I heard it at, but I know that there's a book or article about it. Have you ever heard that thing about the useless jobs, or the BS jobs, or the meaningless jobs? That's what it was about. How many people in the society think they have meaningless jobs, and how meaningless jobs are created? It's 30 to 40% of people working jobs in corporate environments that think that their job is meaningless, that it actually contributes nothing of value.
Yeah. I don't do anything all day.
I'm getting paid for doing nothing. Now, how demoralizing is that? I mean, how much of the crisis is that?
Well, Joe Rogan talks about that all the time. That's a huge percentage. I mean, you mentioned him, but he's one of those almost just images of kind of a, he's got a lot of masculinity in a lot of ways, or Jocko Willink, or even Nick Offerman, who you might not be familiar with. He was a guy on this TV show Parks and Recreation, but he's a comedian, but he also does, he's really famously known for being a bit of a jack of all trades. He has a woodworking shop. He does a lot of woodworking stuff. He's like, he wrote a book called How to Build Your Own Canoe. And he often laments about the very thing that you're talking about. But yet he was a classically trained ballet dancer, and he does theater and the arts, and he's a man.
Right.
I do agree that it's the breakdown of these things. Well, I don't know. We've given a great teaser about it, but I think there's a lot to be mined in that world. And I'm so thankful, and I really am thankful because women in general are less common in this Discord, Paul VanderKlay, this little corner of the corner. But
Yeah.
some of the ones that we have are just fantastic. Like, I haven't interacted with Sevilla at all, but you're wonderful. Karen's wonderful. Sarah's wonderful. Shelly on the Discord's great. I mean, there's a lot of. Sherry and Shelly. Sherry is. I adore Sherry. I mean, when I see I guess it's masculine and feminine, it's men and women, but when I see, like what you're saying, that light shining through particular individuals, when people are being what they're supposed to be in the best way that they can, I get so excited.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Yeah, there's just some terrific people. I mean, just the level of the discourse is just amazing. I mean, I feel all the time like this is something I have to live up to.
Yeah, well, you're doing a great job. I mean, you're a very great voice in the throng, in the symphony.
Well, thanks. So are you, Luke. Yeah,
Thanks.
your spirit is so wonderful and patient and loving towards people. So you're terrific. So it's great. We're all this is, I think this is a fruit. This is going to be one or possibly a number of the jewels in Paul VanderKlay's crown.
Oh man. No kidding. And I don't know, he's such a humble guy. He's evolving well. He takes criticism well and everything. Like, I think it's interesting. His last video was, I'm interested. I hope he gets the courage to release whatever video he was trying to release. I mean, I want him to be, I don't know. I want him to be true, like that, the inner man or the inner voice, or what Jordan Peterson talks about, or the true self. I mean, he should, in quiet, in the stillness, in prayer, he should just follow what he knows to be true and releasing it. But like, I don't know. I see stuff happening with him that I think are hard but good potentially too. So
yeah, and it's widening. It's the I mean, with the conference that they're going to do in Canada, I mean, it's widening, and hopefully it still remains with the with the love that it has. I know it's hard. The more people you bring in, the more the margins will start to invade and things like that. That was I had a lot of fear about starting a YouTube channel, or even going my first video I did with Paul VanderKlay, because I looked at comments under various YouTube channels for a number of years, and I saw that there was a lot of just rude brutality and viciousness toward women on the internet, and so I really was pretty hesitant, but Paul encouraged me a lot, and I've been continue to be very encouraged. John Vervaeke has given me a lot of encouragement. Sevilla King, she did it first, I think, in this little area, and it was watching her that really gave me the courage to do it, and kind of a model of how to do it. So I owe a great deal to her, and I'm going to be talking to her very soon too. So.
Oh, nice. Wonderful.
All right, Luke. Well, it was great talking to you, and what am I supposed to do with this? Well, let me stop the recording, say bye, and then we can talk about what I'm supposed to do technically.
Okay.
Okay. Bye for now.
Yeah.